Welcome. Thank you for coming. I want to tell you a story about a high school student in Goodland, Kansas. And this high school student had a teacher who, in history class, constantly defended the Warren Commission, which, as you know, was the official finding that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Well, this high school student, who is our speaker today, he got curious and decided to do his own research. And he first started interviewing people who were actually there in Dealey Plaza where President Kennedy was shot. And all these people talked to him, but the eyewitnesses told him that they heard anywhere from 2 to 11 gunshots, okay? So he decided to dig further, and he actually interviewed and knows personally those people in Parkland Hospital, doctors, who fought to save Jack Kennedy's life, okay? So he knows these people. Dr. Charles Crenshaw was one of them, Dr. Ron Jones, and I wondered how in the heck did he get these people to talk to him? And here's the deal, is he called them and said, "My name's Brad Parker. I'm a high school student in Goodland, Kansas, writing a term paper on the Kennedy assassination. Would you help me out?" And that got his foot in the door, because everybody wants to help out a high school kid who's trying to write a paper. And it's just astounding, some of the people he interviewed. I mean, I'll let him tell you about who he talked to, but he's an expert on the JFK assassination. He's published numerous books, articles. He's spoken at lots of conferences. And I will say this, that on any crime scene, I know this as a lawyer and he knows it as a law enforcement officer, it's who gets there first, who sees the scene first. And he's going to do a presentation on what these doctors who tried to save Jack Kennedy's life saw that day, okay? Now, Brad Parker is a policeman from Goodland, Kansas, and he is a friend of Andrea Hayes, and that's why he's here. He attended Bethany College with Andrea. And he's been in law enforcement a long time, and he spent, I'd say, thousands of hours researching this matter, and I think you'll find what he has to say very interesting. So let's give a big Nebraska welcome to Brad Parker.
Thank you. I hope I live up to that introduction. I'll be very honest with you, I haven't done a talk like this in quite a while, so I'm a little nervous. I'm sure you'll pick up on that. Again, the high school thing that he hit on, I will touch on that briefly, that for any of the young folks here, which, you know, I used to be one of you, if you can get your foot in the door, if there's something that interests you and you can get your foot in the door now's the time, whether it's September 11th or you know, the Boston bombing or whatever it is. If you have anything that interests you, get on it now, because when they meet you when you're young, they're not afraid of you. When you get to be my age, they think, well, this guy, he might be writing a book, he might be doing this or that, so go with it now. And then once you establish that connection, you can you know, refer back to them later. But what I'm here about the wounds that John Kennedy had when he got to Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas. I will run, in order to understand the significance of that, I'm going to have to run over kind of the official version of what happened so that you kind of see how they're different, because they are quite striking. I'm not going to hit too much on the autopsy, but I do have to outline a few things. But before that even, I'm going to cover, because people sometimes don't know this, and that's fine, why does a gunshot result in a small hole on one side and a giant exit wound on the other, if it's a big enough round? Basically, you have a round that comes in, depending if it's a handgun, ammunition, it'll be about 1,000 feet per second. Rifle, 2,000 and above. The round comes in, and if it hits bone like this one, and this is from the House Assassinations Committee drawings, it hits bone, that bone comes out in a beveled effect. It kicks off what are called secondary missiles, which are bone fragments. If you have that in a skull, that's what you get. Because if you've ever thrown a rock into a puddle, and you see that shock wave that goes off, that wave that comes off, that's going off in every direction, not just on the surface. So when that bullet hits the water in the tissue, whether it's a brain or just in your arm or something, it causes that shock wave to travel, and it magnifies for a short time. And as it comes out, it's quite big, and it's running in front of the bullet. It's faster than the round. So that is basically why that works that way. I have one other kind of a ballistics thing that I will show you. This is from somebody's handgun study. But you'll see when these rounds come in, they come in and they create what's called a wound cavity, which is a giant shock wave that it's a channel through the body. It's usually biggest closer to the wound. So if your tissue that you're going through is here, it's going to leave an exit wound about that big. If it exits further into the body this way, it'll be a smaller hole once in a while. That's pretty unusual, though. Disregard this giant one at the bottom. That's 50 caliber ammunition, which you don't run into that real often. I've been to some shootings, but never one with a 50 caliber. Dealey Plaza. A lot of people have never been there, never had an interest in it. This is the layout of the plaza. The book depository building, the 6th floor window there, that's where the government says Lee Harvey Oswald was firing a bolt-action Mannlicher Carcano rifle. He's coming down Elm Street there, gets to about this area here, and the shooting actually started up here about where the E is. The final shot hit him around the area of that arrow there. The so-called grassy knoll that you hear about that sounds all very mysterious. Actually, it's a wooden fence on top of a hill with some trees in front of it. That's this area here. You hear that referred to a lot. I will draw your attention to this white building here, the Dallas County Records building. That's going to come up a bit later in the presentation. Here is a summary of the Warren Commission findings. 3 shots, that's approximately where they're placed. The third shot actually missed the car entirely and struck a curb, and this drawing is incorrect. This drawing should show that line going to the red dot instead of over there to that slanted line. Is it red on there? It is a little bit. That red dot right here is actually where that round struck the curb, kicked off a spray of concrete. A guy named James Tague was standing there and got hit with concrete pieces on his face. So this is what we have. This is, maybe I should have gone with black and white on this. This is the official version. We have a round coming in to the back of Kennedy's neck there. I'll show you in a minute where it exits. This is the head wound, strikes him about there and blows out the side because he is leaned over like this when the round hits. So he's hit the side of his, top side of his head's gone. That's their drawing. And I used to show autopsy photos on this stuff. Chose not to do it here. They're out there if you want to look them up. But I'll show you when we're done here. Those autopsy photos, they're not accurate. This is where that back wound exits. This round comes in above the left shoulder blade. The autopsy pathologist did a horrible job of saying where that round went in. It exited right in the trachea. In fact, it clipped his necktie as he was riding in the car. Exited there, and the Warren Commission says then that it went on. This is what you hear called the single bullet theory. Anybody that's paid attention to this stuff. This actually does work. This is copied from a book many years ago, and I couldn't put my hands on the book recently, so I'm sorry for the quality. Single bullet theory has that round going through Kennedy's neck and into Governor John Connally of Texas, going through his chest, through his wrist, and ultimately landing in his thigh. Kind of see that. The single bullet theory works in theory. I didn't believe that until the last few years. Single bullet theory works as far as the geometry of it, that the bodies kind of line up and the round could conceivably work that way. I don't think it happened that way. But before I get too far into that, I'm going to just cover, we now have 3 versions of what happened. We have, the top one is a drawing done by the U.S. Navy so that the Warren Commission did not have to publish the autopsy report or the autopsy photos. You can notice that the guy who published this book that I took this out of, Stuart Galliner, wrote a book called Cover Up. Excellent book if anyone wants a very brief overview of this case. He's moved the head to line up with the way Kennedy was. This is actually the only frame of the Zapruder film that I will show you. This is 1/18 of a second before he struck in the head. You move that head in the Navy drawing just right to line it up with the way it actually was. That round would have had to have been coming out of the trunk. That didn't happen, obviously. In 1978, the House Assassinations Committee published Warren Commission version number 2. That says that, oh, we did move the head wound from that low position here. We moved it up 4 inches. We've changed our minds. This is what the head wound looked like. And oh, by the way, we do have scientific proof of a second gunman firing from the grassy knoll. But that guy must have missed because the autopsy report says that he was only shot from behind. Have a guy firing at 111 feet, he misses, but the guy 270 feet away makes the shot. But now, okay, this is what we're getting to. Parkland Hospital, Kennedy's shot at 12:30 exactly. He gets to Parkland Hospital at 12:35. The first doctor to see him is named Jim Carrico. This is what he sees. He sees a small 3 to 5 millimeter hole in the throat. There were a limited number of physicians saw that wound because it went through his windpipe. He's actually turning blue, which at that time tells them he's at least trying to breathe. So they need to get a trach tube into him to make sure, because that wound had offset the trachea just slightly to where he's not able to get the air that he needs. So a few, 5, 6 guys saw this wound before Dr. Malcolm Perry does the tracheotomy incision. These drawings are done by a doctor who was there and who saw these injuries, Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who was a pretty good friend of mine before he passed away. Dr. Crenshaw, these drawings were not done for me. They were done for another author, and I got copies from Crenshaw. This says Dr. Perry did a very, let me see, I'm not used to these document projector things. Dr. Perry cut through the entrance wound, incision sharp, smooth, 1 to 1 3/4 inches. That obliterated the throat wound. So much so that when he got to autopsy, they didn't know that there was a wound there, or that's what they said. They had to talk to the Dallas doctors and find out, what was that thing in the throat? Oh yeah, that was a bullet hole and we made it bigger. So the autopsy people actually missed a wound. Did you have something?
Are you talking about Bethesda?
That missed the wound? That would be Bethesda. Excuse me, folks. Like I said, I'm a little nervous. Everybody that saw that throat wound said they thought it was an entrance wound. These guys saw gunshot wounds every single day. In fact, Parkland's emergency department was called the Knife and Gun Club. They didn't see rifle injuries that often, but they saw handgun rounds every day. And Dr. Ron Jones, who was a fifth-year resident there that day, another guy who was extremely kind to me and who helped me get a lot of the material in focus, he said that their impression, they had no history of anything. In fact, he said it like that. He said, we had no history of anything. He was just there. They didn't know if it was a rifle. They didn't know handgun or nothing. They didn't know he was in a car. They knew that they had a president with a gunshot wound to the throat and one to the back of his head, which I'll get to in a second. But the doctors, seeing this entrance and what appeared to be an exit in the back, which I'll get to in a minute, they thought possibly somebody, maybe he'd been out shaking hands at the airport or something, and somebody walked up with a pistol, maybe at an upward angle like this, popped him in the throat, and it either went out directly or maybe it hit a vertebrae and went out that way. This is the same exact scenario that Squeaky Fromm, when she tried to kill Gerald Ford in September of 1975, used. She was in a crowd of well-wishers, pulled out a pistol. Luckily, the round wasn't chambered because Squeaky Fromm didn't know what she was doing. But they've got this throat wound, and this time they're concerned about the head injury, but the number one thing is they've got to get him breathing. So they do the tracheotomy, and his color starts to come back. And at that time, some of them that had kind of been looking at the head wound but hadn't really done it closely, they start to see this is a good size wound. Everyone that I talked to described it as baseball size or bigger. I got one estimate, 5 to 7 centimeters, which is 2 to 2 3/4, 7 by 10 centimeters, which works out to almost 4 inches across in the back of the skull. Dr. Ron Jones, he was quoted in a book saying, "If you brought him in here today, I'd still say he was shot from the front." That quote was taken a little bit out of context, but I'm going to show you why he said that. This is what they've got. This, again, is a drawing by Crenshaw. Most everybody's seen the Zapruder film, the film of him getting shot. Okay, you'll notice in there that in that film, there's stuff coming up, and his head kind of opens up. I won't get into this too much, but it is possible you can reconcile that with this if he had a larger wound than this, and that the scalp had been closed by Jackie Kennedy, which she did state that she had done that. This is what, it's more striking from the rear. That's a pretty big hole to have in the back of your head. By this time, the doctors had, they'd done chest tubes, which he had a little bit of air in his chest cavity, which really he shouldn't have had. That there's no real reason that he should have had that. It's possible it could have been related here. Generally, if you got air in the chest cavity, it means you've got a lung that's wounded. That's part of the back wound. I'm just touching on that to show they didn't miss the wound. I'm going to tell you they missed a wound, and I'll explain why they did that. Dr. Robert McClelland was one that, during the tracheotomy incision, he was holding what he called the idiot stick. It's a retractor, that he's holding it, and in the meantime, he's at Kennedy's head. He's holding it like this, and he can look. He said, doing what I was doing didn't take any particular amount of attention. I'm just holding it. So I could look at the head wound in great detail. And I'll come back to McClelland, but McClelland, well, I'll tell you what, we're going to go with McClelland now. This drawing was published in a book in 1966 by a guy named Josiah Thompson. In it says, a pictorial representation of a wound described by Robert McClelland of Parkland. Then I read that maybe he didn't draw that wound. So I sent him the drawing. 1994, January 94. I mailed this to Dr. McClelland. I'd already interviewed him a couple times. And he says, this is an exact copy with regard to location and dimensions. I'm not sure what he means by exact copy with regard to location and dimensions. I think he's meaning to say, yeah, that's a Xerox of what I did. But here is Dr. McClelland's drawing. Lines up very similar to the back of the head that I just showed you a few minutes ago. This drawing, I was in college at the time. In fact, I just met Andrea Hayes at that time. She probably remembers the letter writing campaign that I did. I harassed these guys from Parkland Hospital saying, I need to know, is this what you saw, this drawing by McClelland? Do you stand by that? Is that halfway accurate? I got some very good responses. Ron Jones, he's actually the first Dallas doctor that I interviewed. You see there, it's made out to my dorm room in Lindsborg, Kansas. And I did start pre-med. That's a whole other story. I found out these doctors, they have these beautiful cars and great families. They never see either of it. The cars in the parking lot at the hospital, they sleep on a gurney in the hallway. This is horrible. What am I signing up for? You can read the whole thing if you want to. This was actually highlighted a number of years ago. I was kind of compressed for time on getting ready for this. Some of the autopsy x-rays and stuff, I can hit that. Dr. Jones likes to leave a little leeway to, he'll tell you he was shot from the front, but he qualifies it by saying, we've got to go back and look at what was found out. In this, he's referring to the McClelland drawing, and Dr. Jones, you can find some great clips of him on YouTube if you put Dr. Ron Jones. Extremely articulate guy. He's multiple fractures, not with those defined edges. Basically, Bob McClelland did a bad drawing, but yeah, that's generally what it was. That's McClelland. Another guy that I contacted was a guy named Paul Peters. This guy's a urologist, and They'd heard the president had been shot. Everybody's at lunch that day, and they hear the president's coming in, he's been shot. Obviously, they don't need a urologist in the emergency room. He said, you know what, I thought that probably he'd been hit in the shoulder or something, and I was going to sneak down there and see if I could get an autograph from the guy. So actually, he ended up taking part in some pretty serious, he helped put in a chest tube, which that's a very delicate procedure. Here's Paul Peters, Southwestern University Medical School at Dallas. That is the teaching hospital associated with Parkland Hospital. Again, 424 North First, that's my dorm. This is what he included. I'd sent him another drawing, which I don't have with me, but it was the McClellan drawing, and then he put an X next to it, and he drew a line from the X to the wound. That was done by Dr. Peters, and basically, I didn't understand what the X meant. I didn't know what he was pointing to. So I sent the plain McClellan drawing to Peters, and this is what I get. Occipital parietal, I need to cover that.
Brad, off-site, they can't read the letters, so if you
Okay,
could
okay, I'm sorry.
tell them what
Okay.
you're highlighting.
Okay, this is March 3rd, 1994, to me from Dr. Paul Peters. And there's a whole, you can see he wrote quite a bit. But the wound I still maintain was occipital parietal, and I believe the drawing you included extended too far down the neck, which that hole did go that far. Occipital parietal, the human skull is divided into a whole bunch of bones that all kind of fuse together. Parietal bone is up here. It's kind of the top side of your head. You got a right and a left parietal. And in the back, you've got a triangle back here that forms the occipital bone. So when a doctor says it's occipital parietal, he means it involves both the occipital bone and the parietal bone. He's putting that wound right here. Down here, he says, I told him there was a large 7-centimeter hole at least in the occipital parietal region. Basically, the drawings that I've shown you with the big hole like this, that's what Dr. Peters is saying. Dr. Peters, again, an extremely, almost obsessively articulate man, so he didn't put anything in layman's terms, which actually I didn't want things in layman's terms. I wanted it in their wording. Dr. Jackie Hunt, I sent her the McClellan drawing in 1993, and I'd interviewed her on the phone, and she said it was posterior, of course, meaning the back of the head. And so I sent her the drawing and said, is this kind of what you're talking about? She, this is the only handwritten letter from a Dallas doctor that I've got. I love this letter. She had really never talked to too many people. She testified to the Warren Commission, did not testify to the House Assassinations Committee in the 70s. She'd given one interview in about 1975 to the Boston Globe. And that, I called her about that interview, and she said, yeah, somewhere on the right posterior area of the head. And for those off-site, this says the drawing, the McClellan drawing, agrees with my statement, quote, somewhere on the right posterior area of the head, and that is still my statement. For those that can't read it, some of the rest of this is she's talking about how upset she was that happened to Dallas, and certainly not discounting that. I just don't have time to go over every single thing. This drawing, again, maxillofacial surgeon. This guy operates on your face. If something happens, someone busts up your face in a fight or something, this is a good guy to know. He's another guy, I think, that basically wanted an autograph. That because no one can comprehend that the president is dying. He was young, he was full of energy. Oh, it's got to be a flesh wound or something. So these doctors just converged at different times. I'm not saying they were all there at one time. We've got 25 Parkland doctors in and out of this one emergency room because the president's there. Dr. Don Curtis was one of them, and Dr. Curtis actually did take part in the resuscitation, but he says in a letter October 25th, 1994, the drawing by Dr. Robert McClelland is essentially my recollection of the wound suffered by John F. Kennedy. Then he says, please let me know if you have any further or if you need any further information. So I called him. Well, you don't know where this is going because he said, you know, it's been a long time. I just really don't want to talk about it. I said, why'd you put it in your letter? He was very cordial. I mean, he was very gracious. But Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who wrote a book that I believe Marty has read, this guy, he was a very good friend of mine, and the reason he became a friend was because when his book came out in April 1992, it says on the front cover, the man who saved, who tried to save John Kennedy, states that he was shot from the front, or something like he was shot from the front, shots came, something like that. And I saw he was just getting bashed in the media, that they were trying to discredit this guy, and I just felt it was, this guy's loaded. Well, he's not writing a book just to make money. This guy's got something to say. So I called his house. I found his phone number in the book of the Fort Worth phone book, and I called his house and got his wife, and she says, I'll give him a message to call you. I think he will want to talk to you. Because I was calling to voice a bit of support for the guy, because he was just getting pummeled in the media. And I thought, you know, who am I? He doesn't care who I am, but somebody needs to let him know that, that somebody supports him. And I think I got to him just at a point where kind of he felt like he had no friends. And here's this kid who's nobody, calling from Kansas. And we actually became pretty good friends. In fact, the day of the Oklahoma City bombing, we were scheduled to do an interview, and I called his house because that was the time we agreed on. And he said, I really don't want to, let's just watch this CNN stuff of Oklahoma City. So we ended up watching the Oklahoma City bombing stuff unfold on the phone together. This is what happened when Crenshaw's book came out. Doctor says Kennedy was hit from the front. Two colleagues, here's another one, two colleagues question a claim about wounds. Paragraph number 2, Dr. Kenneth Sawyer, who said he worked with Dr. Charles Crenshaw in emergency room where Kennedy was treated, suggested Thursday that the frenzied emergency room was not the place to make sound conclusions about the wound. And he's quoted as saying, anybody can make a statement without, or make an observation and make a statement about it. And some have a little more expertise than others. He's trained as a general surgeon. He's basically trying to say, yeah, Crenshaw doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm going to show you in a minute what Ken Sawyer's talking about, and it's not impressive at all. Another doctor said we were trying to keep the president alive. We weren't trying to establish the forensics of the case. When you're a doctor and you've got a baseball or softball-sized hole in the back of somebody's head, you know that's not an entry wound. You know that a little tiny hole in a neckline, that generally tends to be an entry wound. So these guys what happened was they all testified to the Warren Commission in '64 to what they saw. Actually, nothing I'm telling you is new, okay? You can get the Warren Commission report, go into the doctor's testimonies and their handwritten reports. Everything in there, all you got to do is learn the language, which is not hard because I did it when I was 17. All of it's saying he's got a huge, huge hole in the back of his head. But then a few pages later, we published the autopsy report, which says, oh, the back was intact. He just had this little tiny entrance wound back there. You know, there's a problem. But none of this stuff is new. But the House Assassinations Committee in the 70s, now suddenly we're re-interviewing the same people for another congressional investigation. And they tell exactly the same thing. Yeah, he had a big hole in the back of the head. By about 1989, 1990, these guys are starting to get real tired of people like me calling them. They're starting to figure, you know, maybe if I just went along with this autopsy stuff, you know, my evenings would be quiet at home. Because I was calling people at home in the evenings. I mean, that's when to get them. But one of these guys that really was excellent at this was a guy named Malcolm Perry. Malcolm Perry, who's now deceased, as most of these guys are actually, Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center, Chief of Vascular Surgery. This amazing career this guy had. He was in charge of Kennedy's treatment. Again, to me at my dorm room. And the bit that I have highlighted for those off-site, dear Mr. Parker, no one except Dr. Kemp Clark carefully examined the head wound. Dr. McClelland arrived after I called for help and assisted me in a tracheotomy. We were rather busy. Basically saying, whoever says whatever, don't listen to them. No one knows. We were too busy. Thereby, the conclusion is, Crenshaw, don't listen to Crenshaw, don't listen to McClellan, don't listen to Jones, don't listen to anybody because no one really saw anything. That's not true. Malcolm Perry, I actually wrote the article was about, I call it the subjective degree of medical certainty. Because these guys are constantly moving these wounds around, and Malcolm Perry plays a big part in that. And by the end of it, Malcolm Perry was not a big fan of mine. But, I'd call these guys and say, but that's not what you said. Yeah, it is. That's what I said. One guy, Marion Jenkins, anesthesiologist, testified again in 64 and 78, back of the head's gone. By 92, he's changed his mind. I called him up. I'm 17 years old. He has nothing to fear from me, so he takes my call. In his written report of that day, he said a considerable hole in the external occipital parietal area, considerable amount of brain tissue extruding throughout. There was cerebrum and cerebellum extruding from the wound. Cerebrum is the white part. When you think of brain tissue, it's the white part, the kind of yellowy, off-white stuff. Cerebrum is very different than cerebellum. Cerebellum is gray. It's back here basically, if you draw a line between your ear canals, it's below there. And it's got a different texture, different color. There's nobody going to mistake that, especially anybody that's been to medical school. So I asked McClellan, asked Jenkins, you saw cerebellum coming out of the wound. He said, no, I didn't. So I quoted to him from his report of that day. I got it on page 530 of the Warren Commission report. He says, no, I didn't put that in that letter to Administrator Price. That's not right. So I sent him a copy. Never heard back. Dr. Perry, in that letter that I just read, mentions Dr. Kemp Clark. Kemp Clark was the head of neurosurgery. He's actually the man that pronounced John Kennedy dead. I was never able to get the guy on the phone. He never returned letters, and I tried. This steel worker from, where's he from? Memphis. Somehow, I don't know if maybe Clark had been drinking or something, but he got him to talk. So he called him up, and on January 5th, 1994, David Narrow writes to David Narrow sums up his case to Dr. Cyril Wecht, who some of you may know. He's always on Fox News or Discovery Channel screaming about something. Mr. Narrow says, I asked Dr. Clark what the president's head wound looked like. Dr. Clark said the back of the president's head was blown out. I asked Dr. Clark if the wound in the back of the president's head was an exit wound or an entry wound. Dr. Clark's response was, in my opinion, the wound was an exit wound. No one's ever talked to Kemp Clark other than a government agency, and this guy did it. And I kind of interviewed the guy myself, trying to decide, is this guy authentic, this David Narrow guy? Who is this guy? Is this legitimate? Everybody that I talked to that knew him, and I come to the conclusion, I think it was legitimate. That like I said, I know what I called Dr. McClellan at home the first time. I think he'd had a couple drinks. So the tendency to say, no, I'm not talking to you, I'm going to get in trouble, that goes out the window. So, but I mentioned Dr. Ken Sawyer. Dr. Sawyer, from Kansas actually, and I'm not proud of this. Dr. Sawyer testified to the Warren Commission that, yeah, the back of the head was blown out. Gave him multiple interviews. In fact, a guy named Bob Groden, who's a researcher friend of mine, got him on video in 1988, showing him the autopsy photos. Dr. Sawyer said, no, that's not what he looked like. Something's been altered or changed or something, but that's not what I saw. That's as close of a direct quote as I could come up with. I don't remember. I should have written it down. But I sent him the McClellan drawing. This is what I get back. He redraws the wound. This shows back of the head. The main injury was temporal parietal, meaning, like I said, the doctors, they'll merge two bone names and put them together into one term like occipital parietal. He's showing temporal parietal. Temporal bone is actually what you call your temples, a zygomatic bone, but the temporal bone sits kind of behind your ear and goes up a little bit. He's saying, no, this wound was closer to here, which lines up with the autopsy, which I'm getting to here. But Ken Sawyer, I don't know if he's from Kansas or if he just went to KU Medical School. If so, they should not publicize that. But he moved the wound. And he's given multiple interviews since where he's saying, no, you know, the wound was more in the top than the back. So I think you're getting a little bit of a sense of some of these doctors are very truthful, and a few of them have changed their minds a little bit. And I'll show you why. I did this in high school, so you have to pardon the manual typewriter type stuff here. And this is going to be tough to do for off-site. This is the list of the wounds and the tracheotomy incision, which is a little bit contentious. In Dallas, we've got a back wound which is not observed, which I'm coming to. I'll explain why that happened. And that nobody in Dallas saw a back wound. We know we had one because the Secret Service agent saw him hit in the back. But we also have a wound of entrance in the throat, 5 millimeters in diameter. That's obliterated due to a tracheotomy incision. Got a large rear skull injury, 7 to 10 centimeters. We do not have a forward head wound. And like I'm saying, Jackie Kennedy may have closed this up. If you believe there's a Zapruder film, and there are people that do, there are people that don't, she could have closed this up, and then he had a huge amount of hair, way more than I have. But mine's thinning. She could have closed that, and then you could have sealed up with clots and stuff to where they wouldn't really have seen that. A little bit too much speculation there to say, but it is possible. In Bethesda now, we're getting to the autopsy too, in Bethesda, you've got a wound of entrance, again, up here, this is the back wound. This wasn't observed. The throat wound, they didn't see the throat wound. They thought they had a tracheotomy incision. It's a little bit alarming. They should have put a probe in the back wound and then run it through and seen where it come out. They didn't do that, apparently. In fact, by one FBI report, apparently the lead pathologist stuck his finger in the wound, which they haven't done that since Lincoln. They did that a lot with Lincoln, but they didn't have surgical probes really in those days. So the pathologist, he's so competent, he's sticking his finger in wounds, and he doesn't bother to see where it goes, does it come out the throat.
Brad, we have a question.
Okay.
Would you clarify that the autopsy was not done in Texas? It was done in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and I should have put that in the outline.
The question was, where was the autopsy done, right?
Okay, the autopsy was done at National Naval Medical Center at Bethesda, Maryland. It's a naval facility, one of the premier military hospitals in the world. But that autopsy should have been done in Dallas, Texas. There's a homicide occurring in a jurisdiction. What is this, Adams County? If one happens here, the autopsy must be done in Adams County. It's called chain of evidence, that you have to show who has what. We have control. We can track where things go. People sign for stuff. In Dallas, Dr. Earl Rose should have done the autopsy. He was not allowed to do that because the United States Secret Service decided they were going to steal the body. I don't mean steal it as in everybody like slid a jacket over and slid it out the door, but they got it in a coffin and they headed out the hallway. Dr. Rose gets there with the Justice of the Peace there in Ward and says, "This is a homicide here. I'm sorry, turn it around. We're going to the morgue." He said, "No, this is a president of the United States. We are leaving Dallas right now, and you can waive the law." And he said, "No, I'm not going to. This is my autopsy. I'm responsible. We're going to need to do it here." And Agent Roy Kellerman got up in his face. It's not quite like, if anybody's seen the movie Parkland, which don't waste your time with that movie Parkland. There were some comments by some of the doctors that possibly Secret Service guys had their jackets tucked back around their holsters. There was an implication that possibly they were willing to use force if needed. They knew that if they stood up to the Secret Service, they were going to lose. So the Secret Service throws the body in an ambulance and hauls it out to Love Field and flies it out.
Would it be fair to say that Parkland got kind of a bad reputation because of the interference and not being able to do the autopsy?
No, I think Parkland, everybody, Parkland now, it's affiliated with Southwestern Medical School. And Southwestern Medical is one of the best medical schools in the country outside of the Ivy League. It's always had a very prestigious reputation. That's why all these doctors went on to these stellar careers that everyone knows. Everyone at Parkland's very competent. So, yeah, I think most people understood at the time that the body was hijacked. It wasn't anything Parkland did. they tried to do what was right, and no one ever thought that the autopsy was done at Parkland. So, in fact, Dr. Rose did Lee Oswald's autopsy and did an outstanding job. Oswald has a far better autopsy report than John Kennedy does.
Can you speak everybody?
I'm wondering, just for clarification and to follow you, the entry wound in the neck, does that coincide with the trajectory of Oswald's?
Well, Oswald was behind him, so if it's an entry wound here, no. So my contention, and I don't get this from looking at fuzzy photos, which I've done that too, and I've got some pretty firm ideas about where these shots came from. And I'll show you kind of a conclusion slide of where things came from, but I think that neck wound came from the front.
But it would have been virtually impossible because Oswald was behind.
It would have been impossible unless Kennedy was turned around, which he wasn't. We know in the films he's seating forward. The throat wound at autopsy was an exit wound, supposedly. Everybody in Dallas thought it was an entry wound, meaning we've got someone firing from in front of the car. You know, there's not, Oswald can't be in two places at one time, so we've got two positions of guns. And I'll get to that. I don't want to focus too much on precise locations because that's not really what I'm here for. I prefer to kind of let the wounds sort of speak for themselves, or let the doctors that saw the wounds actually speak for themselves. This is a chart, and this is going to be impossible to show off-site to read. Basically, this is a list that I did with Dr. Charles Crenshaw and Dr. Gary Aguilar, who's another researcher who specializes mainly in autopsy stuff. What we did was we listed everybody we could put in trauma room 1 during the treatment of Kennedy. Everybody that saw a wound in the back of the head, that's going to be this long column here. We put X's in that column. All these people saw a wound, a giant wound in the back of the head. Few of them said it maybe extended a little bit into the side, maybe above the ear just a little bit, but not the top. So that's this second column here with these, what are there, 5 X's there? That's kind of a matter of opinion. Where do you define side where we're not listing actual bones? If we could list bones involved in this, that would be fine. But some of these people are not physicians, so you can't ask someone who's not a physician to describe it in medical terms. So we had to kind of generalize it a little bit. Only one guy, Ken Sawyer, the guy, the artist there with the head wound, he said, yeah, maybe it was a little bit anterior there. One guy out of all of these people. So to me, I don't think I'm being terribly articulate here today, and I apologize for that. But to me, it seems like if you've got this many witnesses stating that the hole was in the back of the head, and I don't mean a little hole, I mean a big hole, it's pretty clear what happened. Some of these guys are Secret Service agents that were there. It seems like there's a problem if the wound, I'll show you another similar chart that we did on Bethesda. When I say Bethesda, I mean autopsy. That's, in my mind, they're kind of interchangeable. This, again, this was done when I was in college, so pardon the presentation here. List I did with Dr. Aguilar. This is a list of people who saw the head wound at the autopsy. You'd think that they should all be in this right anterior, top of the head, and right side of the head column. They're not. Look at how many people in the morgue at Bethesda saw a wound in the back of the head. That wound is not described in the autopsy report at all. So, where does the official version come from? It comes from 3 guys named Humes, Dr. J.J. Humes, Dr. J.T. Boswell, and Dr. Pierre Fink. Fink was an outstanding forensic pathologist, but he wasn't in charge. He was the second assistant. The lead autopsy guy was a hospital pathologist, which that's not a forensic pathologist. He's not used to cutting people up. He's used to looking through slides to see who's got cancer, what's going on with this particular tumor, whatever it is. There's a world of difference from looking at a head wound. The second assistant, Boswell, or the first assistant, Boswell, he's basically in the same boat. He spent all day looking through microscopes. And not to negate what those folks that do that are, but they're not qualified to do a gunshot wound.
Is it significant that the right anterior forearm or from the Warren and one other one from a different source.
Yeah, who is that? Fink? Boyers. He was one of the head guys at the medical school. The Bethesda Naval Medical School, or Bethesda runs a medical school also. His guys did the autopsy. So he has to endorse their autopsy report. So that's a good observation there. I never really
Okay,
noticed
when
it.
we have questions in this room, we need to repeat them for the external
Okay.
audience. And then we do have a question from Grand Island.
Okay.
In the films, the head is shown jerking backwards.
Mm-hmm.
Can you comment on that?
That's a whole area there. I'll try to do it as academically as I can. I think it's from a frontal shot, plain and simple. You already know, I think he was shot from the front. But there are people that have done studies on neurology and what happens to nerves when they're suddenly injured. And what does it do, if you pinch this part of your brain, does your hand jerk or whatever? In fact, there's a commercial about that, the Geico thing with the guy doing the surgery. So it is possible that if the brain was injured in just the right manner and there'd be no way to replicate it. I won't say it's possible. I say we can't eliminate the possibility that it would have resulted in a jerk of one part of the body or the other, in this case, the headwind, or the movement of the head backwards. I hope that covers it. I'm going to return real quick to these drawings here, because we're going back to the back wound now. This is where the Warren Commission said this back wound was. You can see it again here. It actually looks kind of like part of the neck here, but it's not. You think, well, that seems pretty solid. The Parkland doctors probably should have seen that, because they've got, they're working, they're bagging him with oxygen, they're doing stuff with the anesthesia machine. Well, it's not quite that simple, as nothing in this case is. Here's the president's death certificate. This says, let me see where that arrow's going, struck in the head by an assassin's bullet with a second wound occurring in the posterior back at about the level of the third thoracic vertebrae. That's quite a ways down. I'm about to show you exactly how far down. This is signed by George Berkeley, the president's personal physician. This is where that is. That's 4 inches down from the top of the shoulder. That's a significant difference here. These are his clothes that he wore during the shooting, of course. Here's a shirt. The shirt lines up exactly. Now you've got people saying, well, maybe the jacket bunched up a little bit when he got in the car. Well, if that's true, the shirt wound should be higher. The shirt's not going to bunch up too, because when the president gets out of his car, his shirt tails are going to be untucked if it's bunched up that much, and I've never seen a president get out with unbunched shirt tails there. Here's another thing. This is pretty good. This
Quick question, who issued that death certificate?
the death certificate. Who issued the death certificate? The death certificate was issued by Admiral George Berkeley, United States Navy. He was the president's personal physician, and he was in the emergency room in Dallas. Actually, they travel with their doctors. So this is a copy of. Is that out of focus there? I hope not. It's not a very good reproduction anyway. This drawing was done by Dr. Boswell. He's the guy whose hands are in all the autopsy photos if you look those up. Boswell's job a lot was he was either handling the body for photos or he was taking notes. This right here, this is where he puts the back wound. Well, now that is not at all where he put it in the diagram that I showed you just a second ago with the drawings. He's put it here, and he didn't want to talk about that when I called him. He said, oh, that was a rough note. I thought we were getting too many notes up higher. We look up high, there's quite a gap up there. So Dr. Boswell, who signed the autopsy report, which put it at the shoulder blade, he's now saying, oh, no, it's actually quite a bit lower. I called the autopsy radiologist in 1993. Again, high school student. He doesn't have anything to worry about. So that's how I got these people on the phone, and he was a little grumpy. But he said, let me find that quote here. He said, let me see here. I thought I had it here somewhere. He said, well, oh yeah, okay. 4 centimeters, basically like 3/4 of, or 1 3/4 inches to the right of the 4th thoracic vertebrae, which that's just going to be about that much difference. So if you take these wounds, whether they're the 3rd thoracic vertebrae or maybe they're the 4th, and you draw them in here. Now, I don't know where Galliner got this T1. T1 is thoracic vertebrae number 1. Disregard that one. That line is actually, that's on the original drawing. I drew in, obviously, the other 2. If that wound is at the 3rd thoracic vertebrae, like the autopsy or like the death certificate says, it's going to be coming this low if it's going to exit in the throat. If it's in the level of the 4th thoracic vertebrae, it's coming in even lower. So actually, if he's sitting up or even if he's kind of leaned over, at best, if you go with this T1 thing, he was shot from the street. He was not in a building. But if you rotate this, there's just no way. He's, he's leaned over, but he's not, he's looking straight down pretty much there. That didn't happen. And this is a horrible, horrible quality graphic that I made, I believe, in high school. And I can't find the book that I got this out of, so I couldn't make a new one. If you take the throat wound this way, the original autopsy wound, like this, through the neck, like the single bullet theory requires, and you compare that to the wound actually sustained by John Connolly of Texas, who was sitting directly in front, this is what you get. The Connolly injury is not really on the same path as the Kennedy injury. This drawing, this full body drawing, this was done by the Secret Service, and disregard this line that doesn't have the arrow on it. They did it wrong. They drew this wrong. So Dr. Shaw, Robert Shaw, who I interviewed and who said, quote, I never believed the single bullet theory, he redrew the line for them, and then he initialed RRS, Robert Roeder Shaw. So this means we now have 2 guns. I said the single bullet theory works in theory, and it kind of does, because you can slide the seat over and make the bodies line up to where you could have the wounds, the wounds line up this way. They don't line up this way. The angles are all wrong. There's only one building in Dealey Plaza that will give you that angle. And I'm going to have to backtrack just a second after I'm done with this, and then I think we're done. I showed you that drawing where I said the round had been placed wrong with where it hit the curb. If you look, this is actually sort of, if you go by the wounds, this is what it looks like. You've got the round coming off this building. That will give you 27 degrees relative to the body axis. That's what Governor Connolly's wound was. This is the only place that will give you that angle. And actually, this other drawing is done from kind of a goofy perspective. And I should have drawn the red line in up further this way. But that building is taller than the school book depository over here. And Oswald is firing, 3 floors below the level of the roof of the Dallas County Records building. So I think the Connolly shot had to come off of there. This building's a Dallas County jail. Nothing's being fired off that roof.
Was the bullet recovered?
From Connolly? That's a whole can of worms there, ma'am. Was the bullet recovered was the question. It's called Commission Exhibit 399, CE 399. I think if you type CE 399 into Google, you will find a picture of that round, yes.
And isn't it true that Governor Connolly, to his dying day, insisted that he was hit with a separate shot from the shot that hit Jack?
That is correct. He also had more lead in his wrist when he died than was missing from Commission Exhibit 399. The bullet that went through Kennedy and Connolly is almost pristine. In fact, it's called the pristine bullet. But yet Connolly's got all this lead in his wrist, and he had a little bit in his chest. So where'd that lead come from? It was a separate round. This is what you've got. You got this shot here. You've got at least 3 shots fired from the book depository, because I debated on whether I'm even going to mention this. The head wound is a lot more complicated than I've portrayed here. There's a whole school of thought led by forensic pathologists who've studied it, and some medical people who think he was hit twice in the head at the same time from 2 directions. That would account for 2, and that would, if you've got, having been on police qualification firing lines lots of times, it's not uncommon to have guys popping off rounds at exactly the same time. So it wouldn't even have to be a coordinated deal of let's all fire on 3. It would be a thing of just these guys are working their bolts, and that's when it happened. It does look like possibly there were 2 rounds to the head, one from the front here that left the, where am I at here? This is weird doing it backwards. This one leaving the large hole that they saw in the emergency room. And then if this one existed, this one that corresponds here, if that one existed, and I think it did, but I've never got a Dallas doctor who could either confirm or deny that the wound could have been closed up and then sealed over with blood matted here. If that round was fired, if the second round was fired, it had to come out of the depository. You've got a back wound here coming from the depository, but you've also got the throat wound. So I think you've got 2 shots from the front. The Governor Connolly wound, that's one from the records building, and then possibly 2 hits from the book depository, and then you got to account for the curb strike. And I did skip just a couple quotes I wanted to throw out there, because I didn't work off my outline like I should have. I'd be going for another hour if I did. Dr. Charles Crenshaw, the guy that did those drawings that I showed you that I actually got to be good friends with, in his book, Conspiracy of Silence, he said, "From the damage I saw there," meaning when he's looking at the Kennedy's wound, "there was no doubt in my mind that the bullet entered the head through the front, as it surgically passed through his cranium, the missile obliterated part of the temporal and part of the occipital lobes before it lacerated the cerebellum." I should have put that up there. Dr. Robert McClellan, who today actually is his 84th birthday. I found that out online the other day. It's not like I sent him a birthday card like I should have. McClellan said, this is from an interview he did with me September 10th, 1992. He said the bullet hit him from the front, hit him tangentially in the side of the head, meaning there's no distinct entry and no distinct exit. They basically just clipped him, and it all became one wound. Tangentially in the side of the head, and probably the bullet, it entered somewhere near the front of that wound that I saw and blew out part of the skull and then continued out the back of the head at the posterior edge of that wound. That's a pretty plausible scenario, especially if you look at where that round would have been fired. That's perfect. Dr. Ron Jones, in the letter, in talking about that quote I gave you that said, "If you brought him in here today, I'd still say he was shot from the front." So I called him on August 10th, 1992, and said, "Did you actually say that?" And by that time, I'd interviewed him a couple times. He was fairly comfortable with me. He said, "Given the set of circumstances as we saw that day, if they brought him in today, I would tend, seeing what I saw, I would say that he was shot from the front." Now, you got to reconsider what you would say based on what's been found out since. But the circumstances as they were when you first saw him that day, my assumption would be the same. I just wanted to throw those quotes out there.
Why is there so much confusion?
The question is, why is there so much confusion?
Okay. I'm trying to name the...
Just from deer hunting, anybody knows.
Actually, the deer hunting came up in one of the interviews that I did with a Dealey Plaza witness, that he saw the back of the head come off in a big pink mist, and he said, "I've shot enough deer out in West Texas." That's very common, that anybody that's been hunting kind of knows what's going to happen. And if you go back and you look at the Dealey Plaza eyewitness statements, most of them will describe, actually in Texas in 1963, a lot of them do use hunting terms. But why there's the confusion is because the autopsy was done not in Dallas, it was done at Bethesda. The guys in Dallas, the reason they missed that back wound was they had their hands full. They had this just crater of a head wound that they knew he wasn't going to live. They had to get him breathing, they were trying to get him fluids, they were trying to put in these chest tubes and stuff. They didn't have time to roll him over. Why would they anyway? Because they knew the thing's going to be rolled down the hallway when they're done, and Dr. Rose is going to do an excellent autopsy. They assumed that. There's no need to roll him over. And besides that, Mrs. Kennedy was there. So when he died, they left the room to give her a little time with him. They didn't think there was going to be any confusion. The Secret Service is why there's this confusion, because they took the body and, like I said, essentially stole it.
The Zapruder film shows the mess.
Yeah, and actually, if you look, there's a film called the Orville Nix film, and another one, Nix on that, and the Marie Muchmore film, Muchmore. Those films were taken. They're not of the entire shooting, but they've got the headshot, and they're taken from the other side of the street, and you can see bits coming out of the back of the head, whereas Zapruder also shows him coming, the stuff coming out of the front of the head. Now, this is a whole area I'm not going to get into. I'm not even sure why I have it in this notebook.
We have a couple more
Okay,
questions.
okay.
How many of the bullets were found? And then the other question is, can you show the plaza diagram?
Oh, yeah.
And show where the front shots, where you believe the front shots were from?
Okay. Trying to keep this as secure as possible, as far as I'm not trying to give you a bunch of fuzzy photos and interpretations of shadows, but here I could show the diagram too, but the photo is a little easier to see kind of actual buildings. The book depository here, the shots that I believe were fired came from in front, right around the number 3 up there. The bullets, which Commission Exhibit 399 was found, that was found at Parkland Hospital on a stretcher. No one seems to know how it ended up there. But it was found by a hospital orderly, and he knew the president had been seen across the hall, so he took the round to the Secret Service, and they said, oh, yeah, that must be the round. It did match Oswald's rifle, but there's no chain of evidence that Marty mentioned earlier. There's no chain of evidence on that round. It was picked up by a guy, that had no knowledge of anything, but felt like he wanted to help. They don't even know which stretcher it came off of, because he picked it up and took it to the Secret Service, so when they went back, that stretcher was actually gone. Here's the diagram that was asked for. The shots that I think the head wound in particular, if you go by Dr. McClellan's idea of a tangential wound, basically it just clipped the back of his head. That would have had to have been fired from the area of this little tree right there next to the concrete decorative structure there. Yeah, exactly. In fact, like I said, I wasn't really going to show. I could show you. This is actually the photo that got me into this case. I don't know if you can see it. There's a guy standing right here. That's Abraham Zapruder as he's filming the Zapruder film. The area that I think the round came from is right there. Because if you look at that, if you look at the position of his head, that is perfect for that tangential shot. There's also a little piece of something there. You'll notice that shoulder's a little discolored. That's actually a piece of skull tissue or skull bone. Okay.
Well, in the films that you see Jackie Kennedy climbing onto the back of the vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
Is that part of him?
Yeah.
Okay.
She asked when Jackie Kennedy climbed up onto the trunk, basically the question is what's she doing there? She went after a piece of his skull. Probably that piece that I just showed you there. But actually, if you look at that Nix film, and the Muchmore film too, I think, shows a white piece of something come out the back of the head and it landed on the trunk. You can see it in the digitized Zapruder film when the sun's just right. They put it out at the time, though, that, oh, she was panicked, and she went for her Secret Service agent, Clint Hill, who was the guy that ran up to the car. He was actually assigned to her. And, oh, well, she's going for him. She knows they need help. She didn't know he was there. If you look at that film, she has no idea where he's at. She's going after a piece of her husband, yeah.
In your opinion, and based upon your research, does it seem strange that Ruby shoots Oswald? The brain is missing. I mean, the
Yeah.
president's brain's missing.
Yeah, it was apparently stolen from the National Archives. She's asking if, I'm trying to do better about that. She's asking if it seemed odd, given all this, that Ruby then turns up in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters, the most secure floor in the building at that point, and shoots Lee Oswald to death. Yeah, Oswald is not an area that I've really looked at that much because if you look at these wounds, he really didn't have much to do with anything. There are guys, one of the things, and Marty mentioned during the introduction, he called me an expert on the Kennedy assassination. No. If you find someone who claims to be an assassination expert, run the other way, because this case is so complex that no one can know everything. That's one of the early researchers named Penn Jones said, no one can know everything, so everybody needs to specialize. There are people that study Oswald, people that study Ruby, people that study the autopsy. I'm a Parkland guy. And when you get together with these people at these conferences, it's very entertaining because you kind of listen to a lecture and see a picture, a diagram or something. You go, well, that fits with what I'm doing. But you can't know everything. But there are people that know Oswald and Ruby, that know how they may have tied together. Oswald was pretty well documented as he's a communist, no, he's an anti-communist, he's a government agent, no, he's not. Ruby was an FBI informant, he was a mob guy, you know. Who knows if these guys' paths overlapped, whether or not they knew each other. If you've seen all this that I've shown you, and my narrative has been halfway coherent, which I wouldn't bet on, you'd think, well, after all this, and then he turns up dead, there's got to be a reason Lee Oswald was shot. What that was, I can't tell you. That's outside of my area. But I think, you know, one of the things I hate about this type of presentation is that you go through all this stuff, and there's no way to really end it with a big sort of, hey, yeah, that's the key to the whole thing. It's, you go through this and you say, this guy saw this and this said that and he drew this and that. There's no sort of crescendo at the end and then a cymbal crash. That I will leave you with one thing that I stuck to the narrative per the outline fairly well for one thing. The one thing I did leave out, and I hate skipping around like this, the records building shot that I mentioned, the white building with the one round off of, it's a heating and air conditioning crew on that roof in the mid-1970s, fixing some stuff along the Houston Street side there, where the, let me show you this. Yeah, they were up here right along this ledge, right on the Houston Street side. And they peeled back that tar paper stuff that kind of gets on the roof that gets kind of nasty, and they found a 30-06 shell casing. Find me another building in downtown Dallas or downtown anywhere that has a weathered 30-06 shell casing in it. That round is actually, or that shell casing is actually featured in the book Crossfire by Jim Marsh. You can look it up. You can see I'm not making it up. That's another reason I think that shot came off of that building. But I will just leave you with, I wish I could have got these odds updated, but I don't know who to even call. Dr. Gary Aguilar, who's a guy I used to work with quite a bit, he's more of an autopsy guy than a Parkland guy. He's a ophthalmologist, actually, in San Francisco. He has nothing to do with the case other than we both research it. He compiled a list of 42 statements by people who had seen the body either at the autopsy or in Dallas. And 42 of them gave pretty good statements that you could tell what they're saying. 40 of those witnesses, 40, gave descriptions that are completely at odds with the autopsy report. You've got two witnesses, Humes and Boswell, the two guys, the two of the three guys that signed the autopsy report that said, no, this is the way it was, it's the autopsy head wound. 40 of 42 were wrong. What are the odds of that? Well, my friend Gary, he knew a statistician, and he had him look it up. The odds of an error by 40 witnesses out of 42 calculated at 1 in 4.2 billion. That's about the best cymbal crash finale I could come up with for you, so I think that'll do it. Thank you. I'm sorry? No, I said I typically don't. I have them with me. I'll show them to you after. I don't want to show them to a big room of people. I just think that would be a little bit.
We have an interesting question that I know you'll want to answer. A documentary recently stated the theory of a Secret Service agent
Oh, yeah.
accidentally shot by Kennedy with an automatic rifle. What are your thoughts?
That, I worked on a lawsuit involving that claim in 1995. Secret Service agent George Hickey was riding in the Secret Service follow-up car directly behind the president. And right after the last shot was fired, he reached around and he pulled up this AR-15. It's the gun that gets held up in the media now. It's also called an M4. The gun that everybody's afraid of, the black gun that is such a big deal. And this guy from Kansas City, Missouri, I think Missouri, maybe it was Kansas, he came out with this book called Moral Error in 1992 saying George Hickey had actually reached for that gun after the first shot. He's wielding it around in the air, and right at that moment, the driver of the car slams on the brakes. So Agent Hickey goes, whoops, and as he does that, his finger, right on the trigger, blows Kennedy's head off with a .223 round or a .556 round. What are the odds of this? But nobody ever said that this guy shot Kennedy. This is some theory that some author came up with to sell books. George Hickey was still alive when that book came out, and I read in the Baltimore Sun when I was in college, very early days of the internet allowed me to read that said that George Hickey had filed a lawsuit against the publisher and against the author, and I volunteered my research, which at that time was only a couple years old. I had statements from doctors saying he had a giant hole in the back of the head, not a little one, which would completely refute what Bonner Manager was claiming. And I got in on helping research that. That actually was settled out of court, and I don't believe Mortal Error is available in reprints. I think that Hickey won, and they're not allowed to reprint that. So the way they got around that recently, this Australian guy, you said he was Australian? I saw a real quick clip of him. I don't know if he was British or what, but this guy's put out a new book, and I don't recall what it's called. Don't buy it. It's just total. I haven't read it, and you know, I wouldn't have it as a coaster. But he's claiming that the Mortal Error theory was correct, that Hickey's the guy that shot Kennedy. No, that. In fact, I saw the lawyer that I dealt with a lot. He was on Fox News the other night talking about this, and he was very saddened that this has come up again, because George Hickey didn't shoot anybody. And now that he's dead, they know they can't be sued. So, does that cover it? Did you have anything you wanted me to? Yes.
Did you, a bullet was found that you said was matched to Oswald's gun.
Yes.
In your trajectories, did you see then any injuries to Connally or President Kennedy that you see would have come from Oswald?
The back wound could have. That, in fact, the theory by a lot of researchers who like me think that it was from the front. The first shot, most of the witnesses described the first shot as sounding like a firecracker. It didn't sound quite right. Well, it could have been military type ammunition. And once in a while you get you'll get a misfire kind of thing, or a load that isn't quite all there, so the round comes out but doesn't go very fast. It is possible that that bullet 399 was fired into Kennedy's back, went into his lung, which would get to the air in the chest cavity that I mentioned. And then Dr. Perry, not Dr. Carrico as the movie Parkland claimed, Dr. Perry did CPR on him, just hysterically trying to save the president. And it is possible that if that round had only gone in a little bit, that it could have come back out onto the stretcher by Dr. Perry working on the chest. But I'm curious what you're laughing at, sir. You find that an absurd theory?
Yes, I do.
Well, that's...
Because there's no damage to the bullet, and
No.
even at reduced speed, because
Yeah.
of a round that wasn't fully loaded, there had to be deformation of that missile when it struck.
Yeah, and I've got, let me see. I'm really trying not to keep you folks that long. I know some people probably have to leave. Where's it at? What that gentleman there is talking about, deformation of the bullet. For the off-site people, I'm sorry, that lady asked if anything that I had seen would tie Oswald's rifle to it, basically, I think is what you're saying. And then that gentleman was saying, well, that round that could have been massaged out during the CPR, there was no CPR in those days. They called it closed cardiac massage. That's this round right here. This round, like I was saying, John Connolly had more lead in his wrist, and that lead probably would have come off the leading edge of that bullet if it came off. Instead, the base of this round is what's a little bit cracked. It's like it's just been flattened just a little bit. This round, I'm sorry, that's a cotton bullet. This is, see, the cotton bullet looks exactly like Commission Exhibit 399. Easy mistake, but it is embarrassing. This round here was fired into a cadaver's wrist. John Connolly had fractured ribs, plus his wrist. And all this did is go through a wrist. I didn't really want to make this about the single bullet theory, but the Oswald rifle could be tied to the shooting if that back wound was, as that gentleman was laughing at, if that back wound was massaged back out by Dr. Perry. But that is a stretch. That's trying to be as diplomatic as possible. There were fragments found in the car. I think they found a couple fragments in the autopsy that they couldn't really tell what kind of gun it is. Because for those that don't know, when a bullet is fired, whichever one of these two shows it better out there, there's grooves on that bullet. Probably everybody's seen CSI or something, and they can track a bullet to an individual gun. But the fragments that they found in the limousine and in the head and stuff like that didn't have those grooves on them because they're so deformed. When that round hit, it just kind of twisted and mangled and come apart. And they couldn't read the rifling on it, it's called. But it is possible. I'm not going to say none of those fragments came from Oswald's rifle, because they could have. I'm just saying that the rounds that, I think he had a frontal throat wound that lodged in his lung, because it was fired at a downward angle, lodged at the very top of the lung. And then that round was not recovered in Dallas, because they thought, well, it'll be recovered at autopsy down the hall. No, it was taken to autopsy, and they never found a bullet in the chest at the autopsy. But I think the autopsy pretty much it's put up from start to finish, essentially. So. Why? Why would the autopsy, then I'll get to you, ma'am. Why would the autopsy be fake? The autopsy, it's a time, you've got Russians that we're dealing with Cubans, we've got all this stuff. Anything perceived as a conspiracy, if there was a conspiracy, the government can't have that be out, whether they did it, whether the Cubans did it, whether the mob did it, whatever. You cannot have a conspiracy in this shooting, because if you say, hey, there's a conspiracy, at that time, tensions were pretty high in this country, and I think the public would have said, well, then we need to bomb Moscow, or we need to bomb Havana, Cuba, or whatever. There was a lot on the line at that point. So even if the government's not covering up for self-interest, they're covering it up possibly because they perceive maybe they were preventing a war. But, yes, ma'am. I thought you act like you're going to say something there.
I was just going to say CIA.
There's a book out called Bond of Secrecy by St. John Hunt. You ought to read that. I don't want to get too much into who, but that is a theory that it's plausible as to why you would cover this up, is because the geopolitical environment at the time, you might end up with a war or a nuclear war. You just don't know. So you've got to have it be a lone guy. I think that's,
Okay. Thank you, Brad.
did you?
What about
I'm
the
sorry.
small exit balloon in the right upper portion of the skull?
There was no small exit. It was a big exit.
I just want to, my name is Andrea Hayes. I'm the activities director. I did go to college with Mr. Parker, so that's how I met him in the middle of his writing campaign to all these doctors. Every time he was, you know, college kids don't get mail, but he did. And then it was coming from doctors, so it's kind of cool. I just want to thank the other campuses for participating. We had 67 people off-site watching this presentation, and then I think, if I counted correctly, there's about 65 people here in Hastings as well. So when we set this up, I want to thank Sherry and Marty for their support of putting this together. Extended Learning Services, our media department, particularly Mike Garrettson and Ken Gompert for their support in putting this together, and then our PR department for letting all of you know about this event. So I want to just give a shout out and a thank you to all of those people. And then one more thank you for Mr. Parker. And then if you're here in Hastings, we will stick around a little bit so we can answer some more questions individually. Yeah, so thank you very much for attending. I hope you had a good time. Friday is the official anniversary date of 1963.